You mean I have to start talking now?
Yes, right.
For the sake of the slides, I'm going to talk for a few minutes, but then we're going to go into a slideshow. So how dark can we get it in here? I thought the way I'd do it today is I'd first talk a little bit about sacred geometry and introduce you to some of the concepts. I know some of you have studied it before and some of you have studied it with me, so just bear with me if it's a little bit redundant. I want to try to get everybody to the same level of understanding. And then I'm going to talk about the origins of this system of sacred geometry and where it possibly came from. And then I'm going to relate it to something that most people usually don't think of geometry associated with, and that's time. Most of us think of geometry as something being associated exclusively with the measurement of space. And of course, that's its primary application. However, it also relates to the measurement of time as well. And what we'll find out is that there are certain key proportions that one finds in the measurement of various geometric spatial relationships, such as embodied in the Platonic solids. And those proportional relationships are found embedded in the cycles of time. And that's, to me, one of the most important insights of the study of sacred geometry, is that it yields information about time as a cyclic phenomena. And our modern view of time tends to be very linear. We think of it going from the past through the present to the future. And ancient concepts were more cyclical in nature. And not that you had an exact repetition, but that there was a repetition to the cycle, even in the way that our annual cycle can be understood as a reference or as an analog for a much greater cycle. Our annual cycle, of course, is the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, and we, for convenience, divide it into 4 seasons, and we find 4 particular positions of the Sun within the cosmic sphere that precisely defines the inception of those 4 seasons. However, even though the point of demarcation is precise, the response of nature is not precise. Nature responds to it much more chaotically, so that while we can predict with absolute precision the moment of spring equinox or the moment of summer solstice, we cannot predict with exact precision. For example, when will the first freeze of the season occur? When will the first thaw occur? Or what's the temperature going to be on any given day? Or how much rainfall is going to occur in a given season? However, we certainly do know that there is going to be a qualitative change through the course of that cycle. We know that it's obviously going to be much warmer during the summer months than it is during the winter months. And nature does provide us with a measure of orderliness within the chaos that allows us to have predictable lives. And that's all part of this system that we're a part of, this grand system that involves not just our planet but the entire solar system, which is actually in a very delicate arrangement, which arrangement, if adjusted or modified even in the slightest, could essentially preclude the conditions for the evolution of higher life on Earth. It's a very, very delicate arrangement, from the distance of the Earth to the Sun, the mass of the Earth. The tilt of the Earth on its axis is very critical. Without the tilt of the Earth on its axis, we wouldn't have the seasonal change as we know it. And how many of you know what that tilt happens to be? What is that tilt? Does anybody besides Rusty know? 23.5 degrees, exactly. And it's totally that 23.5 degree tilt that causes the change of the seasons. Now, when we say 23.5 degree tilt, what is that measured with reference to?
The sun.
You're on the right track. Plane of the orbit, that was it. What is the technical term for the plane of the orbit? Plane of the ecliptic, yes. The Earth is going around the Sun, and as it does this, it sweeps out a great plane in space. And there's our first geometric correlation. Secondly, the axis of the Earth is not perpendicular to the plane in which it orbits. It's tilted by 23.5 degrees. If it was perpendicular, there would be no seasonal change. The change in temperature would be exclusively confined to changes in latitude, such that the equator would become too blistering hot to be inhabitable. The poles would become permanently frozen, and there'd be a narrow little strip of latitudinal belt within the temperate regions, which would be presumably inhabitable. However, that tilt, as it turns out, I think is very critical to understanding the way the whole system operates, because it's a very cleverly designed system. I couldn't have done much better myself. The size of the Earth is critical relative to its average density. If it was any heavier, essentially the gravity would be so great that we would essentially all still be amoebas. If it was any less, things would tend to want to fly off into space. Geophysicists have worked out that it's, by some peculiar coincidence, the gravity field of Earth seems to be just about what it needs to be in order to facilitate the evolution of higher life forms. The distance between the Earth and the Sun is absolutely critical. A little bit further out and we'd go into a deep freeze. A little bit closer in and we'd have a runaway greenhouse effect. The distribution of land and water is critical. The amount of water relative to the amount of land. The differentiation of the plates. The fact that there is continental lithosphere and oceanic lithosphere is very critical. The fact that we have a moon. Without that moon, we probably wouldn't be here today. No, in fact, we definitely wouldn't be here today. The moon, of course, creates tides. And the tides are fundamental to the whole evolution of life. And my purpose today is not to get into a discussion of, evolution and the biological origins on this planet. However, the moon creating the intertidal zone was definitely key to getting life from a primitive level in the ocean out to a more advanced level on the land. So basically, our world system is a very delicately arranged set of parameters, none of which could be adjusted to any degree and still maintain the kind of balance and harmony that we have. As it turns out, as astronomers now have been learning about other world systems primarily through research gleaned from the Hubble telescope, they're discovering all kinds of other solar systems, but they don't seem to be anything at all like ours. In fact, they have very large planets that are very close to the sun. And that's another factor too. Jupiter, the position of Jupiter in our solar system is also very critical because Jupiter acts as sort of a mechanism to clear out all the debris left over from the creation, the primordial creation. And had Jupiter not been there to do that, one of the things that we'll probably get into this afternoon if we have time when we get more into the Earth change part of this talk will be the discussion of Earth's interaction with the cosmic environment. And that's something that I've been talking about for many years, and it's no less important now. In fact, it's more important now than ever that we understand what the implications of that interaction really are. But in any case, Jupiter served to sort of clear out all of the leftover construction debris, if you want to look at it that way, which, if it was not cleared out, would essentially be regularly impacting Earth with extreme detrimental consequences to the global ecology. And so with Jupiter there, it's tended to clean up our solar system a lot quicker than it might otherwise have been. As it turns out, it's interesting that our cosmic interaction is probably and almost certainly the way life arrived on this planet in the first place. It has also provided a trigger for ongoing evolution of life, but it also can serve to terminate life. And I think that we human beings, as it turns out, are actually a response of the life force on this planet seeking to create a planet that's more or less insulated from the kind of cosmic disasters that have been visited on it for the last 4.5 billion years. We're going to begin by looking at some of the concepts of sacred geometry. Okay, we can do the lights now, thank you. I think of it, this is how I think of it, as the architecture of creation, with the idea in mind that it's sort of a teleological concept here, that there is a design involved. Of course, that implies a designer or an architect, but, and of course, in Freemasonry, that's the fundamental concept of the whole Masonic system, is the great architect of the universe. The idea being that there is actually an intelligence behind the whole thing. I start with the yin-yang symbol because it always seems to be appropriate. The whirling duality here that essentially gave rise to the myriad phenomena that we know as creation. This is one of the fundamental forms that we actually learn how to draw in sacred geometry. It's simply, if you look at it, the geometry of the thing, it's just a circle, one circle, and then there are two circles. The greater circle encloses two circles whose diameter is equal to the radius of the generating circle. And if you follow this, this is 1/2 the arc of a circle, and the rest of the circle would go up this way, but it's not shown, actually making a figure 8 sign in there. And this is in Japanese Zen calligraphy, read from right to left, is the word creation. And it consists of the 3 fundamental geometric forms: the circle, the equilateral triangle, and a rectilinear figure, which could be a square. But in terms of, from simplicity, we start with the circle, and that's the first fundamental act that we perform in geometry. All of geometry starts with the construction of a circle, and we use this instrument here, which is a compass. And in a compass, there's sort of a philosophical association with this compass, because in the traditions of Pythagoras, we essentially have the dynamism and the static and the dynamic conditions of creation represented in that we have a fixed limb and we have a moving limb. And it's through the fixed and the moving that we generate the forms of geometry. And geometry, the way we talk about geometry is we use the language of number to express the relationships. St. Augustine said about numbers that they were the thoughts of God. And I've always kind of liked that. And it seems that in a lot of traditions around the world and from ancient times, numbers had a very special place. Galileo said that mathematics is the alphabet with which God has written the universe. In Proverbs, we find the reference to the compass. This is the voice of wisdom speaking, who was co-creator with the demiurge in the creation of the universe. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was, while he as yet had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set his compass upon the face of the deep. And that principle of setting the compass upon the face of the deep was the inspiration behind William Blake's painting of the Ancient of Days. And you see he has the compass in his hand, and he is about to impart the angular momentum that is the primordial force behind the whole of creation. You see, throughout creation, everything is spinning. Everything is rotating or revolving. When we use the word rotate, we're talking about the Earth. We say that the Earth rotates on its axis, and the location of the orbital center is within the system. That's a rotation. A revolution is a circular motion where the point being orbited is outside. So we have a rotation and we have a revolution. The Earth rotates on its axis, and that's what we're seeing reflected right here in this time-lapse photograph of the south celestial pole. And you can see very clearly there that after a lapse of an hour or two, how the perfect circularity of everything. And this polar point right here is generally fixed for the duration of a human lifetime, but over the longer term, this point is not fixed. This point, in fact, right here is moving in another great circle, and it's that circle that is created by the precession of the equinoxes. And getting back to our Earth globe here, looking at that 23.5 degree tilt, you see, you think of the axis of the Earth as being a pointer. It points to a certain region of the space. There's a north celestial pole and a south celestial pole, right? Well, those are not fixed through time. They're moving because Earth's axis is actually performing this great cosmic dance where it swings around like this, and as it does so, it sweeps out this circle in the heavens. So this point right here is not fixed. It's actually in the process of sweeping out another circle, and that's both true for the north celestial pole and the south celestial pole. Anybody know, besides Rusty, what's the period of this? I call it the Earth's third motion. Very good, Marty. I mean, in round numbers, yes, it's 26,000 years. That's the easiest number to remember, 26,000 years. Come on in, we've been waiting for you. Okay, the 26,000 year period is the time during which the Earth swings through one complete cycle of celestial orientation, like this. It's a precessional cycle. We say precess rather than process because all of the other motions that we generally perceive are from west to east. If you go out and the Earth's turning on its axis is from west to east. The motion of the planets through the plane of the ecliptic is from west to east. The annual apparent motion of the sun through the ecliptic is from west to east. However, the precessional motion is from east to west. Now, how does that precessional motion manifest to our senses in the course of a year? Well, the hinge points, the reference points by which we understand that are the equinoxes and the solstices. And I have a graphic here that will explain that better, so I'll hold the explanation until we catch up to the graphic. But this great year concept is very critical to understanding the whole idea of the ancient cycle of catastrophism and the rise and fall of civilizations. To the ancient people, just as it was believed that, the most obvious cycle governing our lives is the diurnal cycle, which is the daily cycle of the planet rotating on its axis. And that's the obvious, most easiest motion of the Earth to see. As it turns out, that motion is just right at the threshold of perception. I don't know how many of you have ever gone out and watched a full moon rise or watched a sunset, but if you actually really just focus in on it, you realize it, you can just barely, but you can actually see the Earth rotating. You can actually see it rotating if you know what you're looking at. Then the second motion of the Earth is the Earth's annual revolution about the sun, which isn't quite as apparent, but obviously to anybody who pays attention and watches over a course of a few months, it's going to be obvious that something is moving, because what's going to happen is you're going to see that the position of the sun relative to the stars has shifted. And in the superstitious point of view, they believed that the sun was going around the Earth. In fact, that was dogma for many centuries amongst the Roman Catholic Church, that it was the sun going around the Earth and not vice versa. In fact, that dogma was not demolished until the advent of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. And in fact, Galileo was forced to recant his assertion that the Earth went around the sun on threat of torture. You've probably all heard that story. It really did happen. All right, one of the physical or astrophysical mysteries of our universe is essentially why things are rotating as they are rather than just random motion. I mean, why is all the matter of the universe in these organized rotational systems? Well, modern science can't really explain that. Why everything is organized into these rotational systems. Where, in other words, did the angular momentum originally come from? Well, in the traditional view of the world, this is not hard to explain. It was the compass upon the face of the deep, using that as a metaphor. It was God essentially jump-starting the universe by that turn of the compass. And that's what imparted the initial angular momentum. If we talk about angular momentum, the Earth spinning on its axis, we take it for granted that everything is spinning on its axis or spinning around something else. The question then, from the astrophysical point of view, is why that's happening. Why is not everything just in sort of a cosmic Brownian motion? In other words, random motion. Why is it cohered into these organized rotational systems? Well, you know, in the traditional concepts, that's not that. That's what one would expect within that teleological framework, that there was a creative power that imposed that first initial rotary motion. It essentially started the engine of the universe, started the engine of creation. And everything else is a subsystem that has spun off of that. From the initial universal angular momentum imparted at the moment of creation, galaxies or first metagalactic systems were spun off, apparently in rotation. At this point, the metagalactic field is so beyond our range that we can't really say for certain that we see an organized rotational system, but we certainly see organized rotational systems on the galactic level, and on all subgalactic levels that we're able to perceive, we again see organized rotational systems. We see that here, obviously, in a weather system, in hurricanes and so forth. Phi spirals, this is a comparison of how Hurricane Isabel and Galaxy M51, seeing very similar geometry at work. And this is based upon the golden section. How many of you besides Rusty know what the golden section is? Yeah. The golden mean is another name for the same thing, the divine proportion. That's something that we study in sacred geometry. That's a very important, one of the most important principles in sacred geometry is this golden section. And it's basically the idea that you can divide something in a certain way, a very special way, in that the part relates in a very special mathematical way to the whole. And it's the golden section is something that's built into all of us. We're essentially walking embodiments of the golden section. The simplest way to see the golden section relationship is hold up your forearm in front of your face. This is traditionally the cubit. What we say comes from cubitum, the Latin word for elbow. So elbow to fingertip is your cubit. And if you feel around on your wrist, you're going to find this little thing. It's called the space of Destot that marks your wrist joint. There's actually a little hole in there. If you feel around on your wrist, you'll find this little hole, this little hollow. Can you find it? Is there anybody who doesn't have one? Is there? That's a good test to find out if, in fact, a person is actually from planet Earth. They do have one. If you don't have one. Okay, so if you now hold out your cubit and find that little space, what you've done is you've divided your cubit not in the middle, because that creates a static division where one side is just equal to the other side, and that's the end of it. But here what you've done is you've created a division of that cubit where you've got a small section, which is your fingertip to the space of Destot, and then you've got a larger section, which is that space to your elbow, and that mathematical relationship from here to here is exactly the same, well, not exactly, but close mathematically to the larger section to the whole cubit. Does that make sense? So in other words, the small is to the large as the large is to the whole. Now, we all vary a little bit from the mathematical ideal, okay? What happens, though, is if you start measuring a lot of people, and the more individual cases you put into your database, the closer the average actually approaches to the mathematical ideal. There's another way that the golden section shows up in the human body, and that is if you take your overall height. Let's say that my cubit set this way is a scale version of my height. Well, the distance from here, if I put this like on the tabletop, the distance, if this was the floor and this was the top of my head, my navel would be that space of Destot. Should we demonstrate that? Would the most perfectly proportioned person please come forward?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, while she's taking her clothes off, what I would like to do next is, what?
I'm not trying to fuss.
Oh, she's, well, how is,
But you can manage.
oh, I guess, she disinvolunteered. Pardon?
Would you like some tea?
Tea? No, I'm fine for now. Okay. This is a section out of a beautiful Old Masonic lecture. We'll just go through this together. If we consider the symmetry and order which govern all the works of creation, we must admit that geometry pervades the universe. The ancient philosophers placed such a high estimate upon this science that all who frequented the groves of the sacred academy, that's referring to Pythagorean and Platonic academies, were compelled to explore its heavenly paths, and no one whose mind was unexpanded by its precepts was entrusted with the instruction of the young. By geometry we may curiously trace nature through her various windings to her most concealed recesses. By it we discover how the planets move in their respective orbits and demonstrate their various revolutions. By it we account for the return of the seasons and the variety of the scenes which each season displays to the discerning eye. By it we discover the power, wisdom, and goodness of the grand artificer of the universe, and view with delight the proportions which connect the vast machine. Numberless worlds are around us, all framed by the same divine artist, which roll through the vast expanse and are all governed by the same unerring law of nature. This is from an old, early 19th century Masonic lecture. And here was one of the few architects of the 20th century. There's a handful of them who actually were imbued with the concepts of sacred geometry. Paul-Jacques Griot, architect from Italy. The world around us is a world of numbers. Numbers that spell life and harmony. They are organized by the geometry of figures, all related to one another according to a sublime order into dynamic symmetry. Glimpses into this magnificent kingdom form the basis of all our knowledge, and it seems that in this domain, the ancient civilizations had gone further than modern science. This is not something that modern scholars are too readily willing to admit, that ancient cultures actually did become very sophisticated in certain areas of knowledge. He uses this term here, dynamic symmetry. Dynamic symmetry is one of the things we learn in sacred geometry, and it essentially deals with the division of space in such a way that again, as the concept introduced with the golden section, so that the parts relate to the whole in a certain way. The idea here is that when you take any given space, you can subdivide it in such a way that there is a relationship between the parts of it and the whole system and vice versa. And when you accomplish this, you've achieved harmony. Or in this particular phrase that he's using, he's borrowing a phrase that was first coined by J. Hambidge in the early part of the 20th century, dynamic symmetry. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Hambidge Center down in Rabun County, Georgia, or the work of J. Hambidge. He was an artist who rediscovered a lot of the principles of sacred geometry used by Renaissance and artists of the late Middle Ages. And I'm going to show you a few examples of it as we proceed here. In a lot of the earlier Bibles, the idea of God as an architect or as a geometrician was quite prevalently displayed. We can see there that, what does he hold in his hand? That's the compass, exactly. And the idea here is imparting order to the primeval chaos. This is a very interesting figure. The rectangle itself has special proportions, which by the end of our discussion here, maybe you'll begin to recognize. there are geometric things going on around them, but the key is the center of the thing, this wheel of chaos that it's about to have the divine order imparted to it. Here's another version from about the same time. This is sort of the esoteric idea of Jesus as being a master architect. Actually, in the Bible, it refers to him as carpenter, but the Greek term was tektonos, which essentially means builder. And in this application, it refers to an esoteric function of Jesus as the builder of worlds. This particular figure right here manifests sacred geometry. This is based on a rectangle known as the root 2 rectangle, which you'll know more about in a few minutes. Here's a Chinese concept, Fu Hai and Nu Qua, Chinese creator gods. This is Fu Hai, who holds in his hand the compass, and Nu Qua, who holds in her hand the square. And hanging from the square, can anybody tell what that is? That's exactly what it is. It's a plumb bob. So you have the square right here, the compass, and you have the plumb bob hanging, which really is just a big version of the pendulum, isn't it? Yes. And in all building work, this is essentially the first tool that you employ, this thing right here. Once you've found the sacred center, after one of you guys has found through geomantic techniques where exactly that sacred center is, the next thing is the plumb bob is used to erect a vertical pole. And from that vertical pole, the sun, the angular, changing angular relationships between Earth and Sun will provide the geometric key to the building of the edifice or the temple. We see here surrounding these creator gods are the constellations. We can actually recognize some of them. Here's the Big Dipper, there's Gemini, there's Pegasus, several others over here that are too obscure to really tell what they are. I imagine some of them are probably signs of the zodiac. Up here we have a circle divided into 12 with 12 smaller circles subsidiary to it, and that has a number of representations. It's, obviously the zodiacal wheel with the 12 signs, amongst other things. In geometry, there's an interesting concept that if you have spheres of equal diameter, 12 of them will exactly pack around the 13th. And so from that standpoint, it's sort of a reflection of that into the human domain is the number of teachers that have always organized 12 students or 12 disciples or whatever. Then let me call your attention to the intertwined serpentine tail. That I find to be very significant. The figure of the serpent, one of the more maligned figures of ancient wisdom, particularly in the Christianized version. The serpent has become a symbol of evil. However, to most indigenous groups, serpents were considered to be emblems of the life force. The counterpart for the serpent is the dragon. They're cognate symbols in that they're sort of interchangeable, not entirely, but there's no clear dividing line between the serpent and the dragon. The symbolism associated with each is very similar. And here we have the famous Masonic emblem here, which is the square and the compasses, which in terms of the square, what we have here is the compasses are set at a 60-degree angle, and then of course the square is a 90-degree angle. The compass stands in for the circle. So we have actually here a hidden reference to the considered to be the preeminent problem of sacred geometry, which is the squaring of the circle, which represents the reconciliation of opposing tendencies on whatever realm or whatever domain. The squaring of, see, mathematically, you cannot draw a square in a circle of precisely equal perimeter. It's mathematically impossible. You can approximate it to ever closer and closer degrees of accuracy, but you can't actually mathematically do it with absolute precision. So what the ancient peoples did, though, attempt to do was to try to create squares and rectangles. There's two ways of solving the problem. One by creating a square and a circle of equal perimeter, and one by creating circle and square of equal area. But the idea was that this particular problem provided an analog for the solution of any kind of situation involving the reconciliation of opposing forces or opposing tendencies. What's the letter G for?
God.
Yes.
Geometers.
Yes.
God, the sacred G on earth.
I'll buy that. It has actually multiple meanings. But yes, God and geometry are the two, I would say, the two predominant ones. And the idea of God geometrizes, or God as in the role of geometer. The grand geometrician of the universe, as Masons refer to the God principle. There's another version of it, this time replacing the letter G with the all-seeing eye, which of course goes back to ancient Egypt, and I would strongly suspect that the Egyptians inherited this symbol of the eye, the all-seeing eye. This is from Occulta Philosophia from 1613. This is a famous alchemical work. And here we see geometry making its appearance once again. Here we see Rebis, which means the divine consummation, or the completion of the great work. And in this case, we see male and female as equal co-creators within the cosmic egg. The male, just like in the Chinese version, the male half is holding the compass, the female half is holding the square. And the square is frequently a symbol for Earth, the matrix. And so that sort of makes sense there. And then surrounding the figure, we have the 7 sacred planets. We have, starting down here, which one is this? Venus. And Mars. Sun, what's this? Mercury. This is a tough one. And Jupiter and Saturn. Okay. We see a winged globe. That has several multiple layers of meaning, but the one that's probably most applicable in our discussion is, well, you see it's a symbol for the Earth, which is the circle that has been divided into four. The fourfold division of the circle is universally a symbol of the Earth, right? The fourfold division represents the four cardinal directions, okay? And we see within the circle of the Earth, we see the equilateral triangle with 3 sides, and we see the square with 4 sides. And so if you recall, like the Zen calligraphy term for creation, which was circle, triangle, square, we've got essentially the same thing here with the 3 figures juxtaposed. The wings are to remind us that we're on this cosmic journey. Our planet is moving through space at a rapid rate of speed. In fact, every second that goes by, we've moved 18.5 miles through space relative to the sun. And then the sun, in turn, of course, is moving relative to the galactic center. And in fact, as some occult traditions would have us believe, there's actually a subgalactic center that our solar system is orbiting, which is in turn orbiting the galactic center. But in any case, we are moving from some unknown origin to some unknown destiny. And that's what's being symbolized by this winged globe. This represents our world on its cosmic journey. Then we have the dragon. And you'll notice this ferocious dragon, but it's in a position of subordination. See, the human figure here has come to dominate the primordial power of the dragon, has brought it into servitude, has come to show that, that the dragon has become tamed, if you will. Now, the dragon is just a universally rich symbol. It stands for many, many things, but many complementary things. One of the things that the dragon stands for is the telluric current. And as geomancers, I'm sure most of you are familiar with concepts of telluric energy, of energies moving through the earth. But the dragon, you see, has a dual nature. The dragon is not only terrestrial, the dragon is celestial. Dragon generally makes its home within subterranean caverns and lairs, but it has wings, which allows it to come up from its subterranean lair and mount up towards the heavens. And that's an important factor in trying to understand this dual nature of the dragon, and that it's simultaneously both terrestrial and celestial. And part of the idea here is that the geomantic currents, or the telluric energies, are ultimately also cosmic energies that have been concentrated into our Earth and have a geometry of motion within our Earth that essentially can be quantified by studying the distribution of the lithosphere. And that gets us into a whole other realm that we hopefully will have time to talk about this afternoon. And that is the fact that the structure of our Earth's crust is very dynamic, especially in our concepts of post-plate tectonics understanding of the way the crust works. But it also appears that the motion of water through the crust of the Earth is governed by the particular geometric pattern of fractures and fault lines within the crust. The pattern of fractures and fault lines in the crust is a function of Earth's interrelationship with the cosmic environment, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the afternoon session. This is a very rich symbol right here. It's one of those that like all symbolism, it's a coherent message. It's just like if we take a jumble of letters and mix them all up and it has no coherent meaning, but then we rearrange those letters, or we rearrange those words in a certain sequence, and suddenly meaning is conveyed. In occult philosophy, the language used to convey meaning is symbolism. And in occult philosophy, the idea is that words no longer are just words. Words are living entities. And words become symbols. Numbers become symbols. Images become symbols. Animals become symbols. Planets become symbols. And the way they're arranged and put together is what conveys the particular meaning. This is a very specific juxtaposition and arrangement of symbols here that conveys a very precise meaning to somebody who's studying the Hermetic traditions.